Brother, after that talk at the Lord's table, I think we just need to sing the invitation song and go home. Thank you. Thank you for those remarks. So encouraging. And thank you for the way that you have responded to the service this morning and the singing and the prayers. I am just delighted to be back with you again. Turn in your Bibles this morning for just a few moments to the 24th chapter of Luke. Luke chapter 24, and beginning down in verse 13. Let's read about these two men who walked with Jesus, or rather we might say Jesus walked with them, and they didn't recognize him at first. Luke 24, beginning of verse 13. Behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all of the things which had taken place. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you are walking?" And they stood still, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said unto him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem, unaware of the things which have happened in these days?" And he said unto them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all of the people, and how the chief priest and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all of this, it's the 3rd day since these things have happened." But also some of the women among us amazed us. When they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, and they found it just exactly as the women had said, but him they did not see. And he said to them, "O foolish men, slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all of the scriptures. And they approached the village where they were going, and he acted as though he were going further. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he had reclined at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" And they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem and found gathered together the 11 and those who were with them, saying, the Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." And they began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. You know, it's easy for all of us to lose hope. It's easy as we go through life to get weary, to become overwhelmed when things happen and we don't understand, to become disappointed, to become sad and confused. There are times I cannot wrap my mind around the suffering that some people go through. There are places on this earth that would knock any of us down to our knees. I think of the homeless in Honduras and places in third world countries like Haiti. and people that live only by going to the garbage heap outside of the city and surviving on mere scraps as best they can. I think of the orphanages in Eastern Europe where cribs fill the room. And when you walk into that room, it is silence. Not one cry is heard from one baby that is lying there, because eventually those babies figure out there's no need to cry. Nobody's coming. Or you can walk the halls of a nursing home in our country, and people reaching out for you because they long for somebody to care. Or you can go to the other end of that age spectrum and walk the halls of our high schools, where it's the same thing. Whether old or young, people just want to reach out and know that somebody cares about me. How do we find hope in those places? How do we proclaim that God is at work when we can't see him? Where is God in this mess? Where is God in my mess? Good questions. We're not the first to ever ask them. You know, in some ways, we are a lot like the children of Israel of the Old Testament. When you think about everything God had done for them, God had provided for them, God had delivered them from Egyptian bondage, God had protected them. When the firstborn of the Egyptians died, the firstborn of the Hebrews, well, we understand, God passed over them, spared. God saved them. As they watched the wall of water part, and they walked through the Red Sea on dry land, while their pursuers perished. God provided everything for them. And yet, they found themselves in the desert, in the wilderness. And being people and doing probably what we would do, they griped and they grumbled at God. And they said things like, would that we had stayed in the land of Egypt. Would that we have remained there than come out and die in this God-forsaken wilderness. But the wilderness wasn't God-forsaken. God was with them the whole time, although they couldn't sometimes see it. And God provided again. Remember the manna of the Old Testament? For 4 decades, God provided for them. He never forgot, and they never missed a meal, ever. I think about Peter in 1 Peter 2 and verse 3, when he says, you have tasted that the Lord is good. When I think about Old Testament Israel, they literally did taste that the Lord is good. But then again, you and I have done the same. Over the course of time and over the course of our lives, we have tasted God's goodness. We have tasted God's grace. And yet questions continue to swirl in our world. Our own spirit wrestles with things. We get uneasy when we don't know the way. We wonder, where, God, are you taking me? Where are you leading me? I don't understand where this is going. Is God really with me? Is God really walking beside me? Especially, we ask, in the darkest of times, when we walk through the valley of the shadows, and sometimes we cannot see him and feel him near us. In fact, we're just like these two, walking back to their little village 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. We're just like them in some ways. In verse 13, the text says, two of the disciples of Jesus, were going that very day. It's Sunday. It's the first day of the week. And they've decided to go back to their village. The name of the village was Emmaus. The text says it was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they're walking. And verse 13 says they were walking and talking with each other about all of the things that had taken place. I can't imagine their disappointment. We often think of the 12 as leaving everything and following Jesus. Do you understand the 12 were not the only ones to do that? Beyond the 12, there were other disciples who left it all and followed Jesus during the same period of time, including these two. And they had believed. Like the song suggests, I believe in the one they call Jesus. They believed. They believed that he was Messiah. They believed that he would take all of the wrongs and make it right. They believed in a happily ever after ending that didn't end very happily. Instead, they stood there on Friday with their mouths open and their hopes dashed as they watched him die. Crucified. Horrific to witness. This was the one who raised the dead. This was the one who fed the thousands. This was the one who stilled the storms. And he did nothing to save himself. And the images burned into their minds on that Friday would stay with them forever. They'd hung around on the Sabbath. And on Sunday, they decided to go home. It was 7 miles from Jerusalem to their hometown. 7-mile walk. A 7-mile walk of hopelessness. A 7-mile walk of despair. A 7-mile walk of just raw wondering. It's like they walked along and thought to themselves and said to one another, we thought we knew. We thought we knew who he was. We thought he was the one. Verse 15 says, while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing. Even in their hopelessness, Jesus walked right next to them. And then he asked the question in verse 17. What are you talking about? What are these words that you are exchanging as you're walking? And they stood still. They stopped. His words stopped them in their tracks. They stopped. They stood still and were looking sad. They were downcast. And one of them said, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem, unaware of the things which have happened here in these days? And he said, what things? And they said, the things about Jesus, a prophet mighty indeed in word, in the sight of God and the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death, and they crucified him. But we were hoping. I took the highlighter and highlighted those verses, or that phrase in verse 21. We were hoping. We were hoping he was the one. They didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle put together, but they were hoping Jesus was the one. And in verse 22, they said, why, earlier this morning, some of the women among us came back to us and amazed us, and they were saying they had gone to the tomb, and they did not find his body, and they said a vision of angels appeared to them, and the angels told them that he was alive. And you can see the confusion. Just the mind-boggling confusion. And as they are talking with Jesus, and as they are rehearsing these things, and as they're trying to put all of the pieces of this great perplexity together, Jesus began to talk to them about the scriptures. and pointing them to the Word in verse 26 and verse 27. Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in the Scriptures. Do you ever think about how amazing time passes when you spend it with Jesus? How amazing time passes when you let Jesus explain the Scriptures. 7 miles wasn't enough for them to spend time with this one who was explaining to them the Word. They wanted more, verse 29. They urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's getting late. The day is nearly over." And so he accepted their hospitality in verse 29, and he went in to stay with them. Now, I want to stop right there. Because in a way they were blinded, and I'm not sure how all of that worked, but in a way they were blinded from recognizing Jesus. But in a way we are blinded by recognizing his nearness with us. We are blinded by the same despair. We are blinded by the same doubt. We are blinded by the same, sometimes, disbelief. We say exactly what these two said. We had hope. And yet this hopelessness sometimes that fills our heart like a fog, sometimes blinds our hearts to the one who stands right beside us. Don't we sometimes get disillusioned with God? Don't we think in our minds that God ought to do something about this? God ought to act this way. We want to take our lives and we want to write it and we want to hand it to God and say, this is how I want it to go. And when it doesn't go like we have written, we're like, God, where are you? Where are you? I feel like I'm walking through the valley of the shadows and I'm all alone. Where are you? And he says to us, I'm right here. I'm right here. I'm walking right next to you. I've been here all along. But your hopelessness has made it unable for you to see me. You know, sometimes God just wants to go with us. He just wants to walk with us. He says that in the Psalms, the shepherd psalm of Psalm 23, that he will walk with us through the valley of the shadows of life, even of death. And in the process of walking with us, he continually wants to point us back in his direction. And he does that by bringing scriptures to mind, that which the Holy Spirit has revealed for us, that we can read, that we can find hope and peace and comfort. He does that through the promises that he makes to us. He does that by reminding us of the things he has done for us in the past. So here are these two men walking along, and they're downcast, and they're despondent, and we might as well go home. And here's the stranger who comes to them, and he begins to explain the scriptures to them in a way that they had not understood, and their eyes are beginning to open. And verse 30 says, he had reclined at the table with them, and he took the bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he reached and he gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from sight. Wow. Jesus sat down at their table, and he broke that bread, and he blessed it, and he took his hands, and he reached out his hands, and he gave it to them. The same hands that stilled the sea. The same hands that reached out and touched the sick. The same hands that were nailed to the cross the same hands reached out to provide for them. And that's when they knew. They looked at each other in verse 32. They said, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" Yeah. He had made the scriptures come alive. But here's the question. What do they do now? This stranger has explained things to them. This stranger has been walking with them. This stranger has been seated in their house. And this stranger finally makes himself known that it was Jesus, that he had been raised. The women had been to the tomb. Peter and John had been to the tomb. Where was Jesus? And these men like, he was with us. But what do they do about it? They've just walked 7 miles. It's late. It's dark. There's only one way to go back to Jerusalem. They've got to walk it. And I want you to notice verse 33. They got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem and found together the 11 and those who were with them. And they began to say, "The Lord has risen, and he has appeared." It was 7 miles back the way they just came. It was. It was already evening. They're tired. It was. It was dark. It was. It didn't matter. I'm guessing the journey back was quicker than the journey to. I'm thinking to myself, these being younger men, did they walk fast? Did they run? They couldn't wait to get back. They couldn't wait to find the disciples. They couldn't wait to proclaim the truth of what up to then had just been a rumor. They got back to Jerusalem as quickly as they could, and they found the disciples, and they said, "It is true. It is true. We have seen him. We have seen him with our own eyes. He is raised." You ever been there? Have you ever walked to Emmaus and back? On the walk to Emmaus is the times in our lives when we kind of just stumble along. We're so discouraged. Sometimes doubt creeps into our hearts. And we walk along wondering, why has this happened in my life? Why has this happened? Why isn't God doing what I think he needs to do? Maybe God has let me down. Maybe Satan is right. Maybe God's not enough for me. And then as we walk along in the valley of our shadows, suddenly we realize he's right there. The one who said, "I will never leave you. I will never desert you." He's right there. And he's walked beside me with his grace in unimaginable ways. You know, it's easier to walk from Emmaus back to Jerusalem than it is to walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Because once you sit down at the table and recognize the presence of Jesus, once your eyes are open, you can't wait to go tell somebody else. He lives. He lives. And because he lives, I can face today. And because he lives, I can face tomorrow. And because he lives, I can face every tomorrow that's going to come, no matter what. Is it hard to recognize the presence of Jesus sometimes? When life gets discouraging and others maybe whisper doubts in your ear, and hope just sort of disappears? When we don't understand, when we feel helpless, when we don't have all the answers. As you walk back to Jerusalem, as you walk back to God, on that 7-mile walk, there's 3 things that you have to know. God is enough. God is always enough. Regardless of your circumstances and regardless of what you're going through, God is always enough. Second, God is always there. From the ordinary days to the hardest of days, He is always there. And you never walk alone. Ever. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Maybe you and I need to walk. Maybe we need to go for a walk. Back to Jerusalem. Friday grief, cross, the tears, sobs, the disbelief, a mother's heart ripped apart. You know, it's one thing to see your child die, it's another thing to see your child killed by a lifeless mom. Hopes dashed, the grief of loss, the end. I can only imagine. The Sabbath was the longest Sabbath ever. While normally a day of worship and rest, it was anything but. Their thoughts were racing. Sleep escaped them. Food was the furthest thing from their mind. All they could think of was, how could they attend synagogue today when the synagogue leaders had those thoughts? Sunday dawn, early on the first day of the week. The women couldn't do much. They could anoint the body with spices for their custom. As soon as the city gates opened, the women scurried outside of the city to the tomb, and they worried about the guards. They even let them near the tomb, and they worried about the stone. There was no way they could go over the way. I can only imagine. The guards were gone. The stone was rolled away. The tomb was open. How? Confusion, disorientation. The angelic pronouncement, the 7 words that changed the world. He is not here. He has risen. Resurrection. The enemies couldn't stop it. The Romans couldn't prevent it. The disciples couldn't believe it. Thomas was the last holdout. Unless I see. I will and my God. From the city of David to the Emmaus village, it was the talk everywhere. Witnesses confirmed. Jewish leaders conspired. Disciples were emboldened. It changed everything and it turned the world upside down. Men and brethren, this Jesus whom you crucified, baptisms by the hundreds, baptisms by the thousands. And centuries later, his followers still gather from the African bush to the great cities of Europe, from North and South America to Australia. They come to the first day, table. They come to remember, to reflect, to weep, and then their tears turn to triumphant joy as the message comes anew all over again. He lived. He lived. And because he lives, I can face today. And because he lives, I can face tomorrow. This changes everything. I don't have to imagine. I always have to believe. Amen? Let's say that. Amen? Amen. What's all that? That's why we're here. That's why the first day matters. Because it matters to those who better. We sing songs of encouragement. All of the songs today about Jesus and encouragement. Encourage you. You take the first step and become a Christian. Give your life.